In the United States, we have dedicated the season of fall to acknowledging the contributions of Native Americans. Between Indigenous Peoples Month and a more nuanced understanding of Thanksgiving, this is, at least in theory, a time where we acknowledge the contributions of Native Americans to the United States, and there are many. From the food we eat to the clothes we wear, we cannot overstate the contributions of Native Americans to U.S. culture. I'd like to expand on this by looking at the contribution of Native Americans to the history of ideas. Specifically, an idea recently put forward in the book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, by the late David Graeber and David Wengrow. In particular, what the authors refer to as the Native Critique. This refers to the influence of Native American social, political, and economic ideas on European Enlightenment thought, as well as what Native Americans themselves thought about European society at the time of the Enlightenment. Now, this book is incredibly interesting, and if you would like me to do a more thorough examination of it, please let me know in the comments below. For those who just need a quick refresher, the Enlightenment refers to an intellectual and philosophical movement within Europe in the 1600s and 1700s, which explored and promoted a focus on the use of reason, the limits of political power, individual liberty, and the separation of church and state. The two authors begin by exploring an essay contest from 1754, put on by the Académie de Dijon in France, which asked the question, quote, "What is the origin of inequality among people, and is it authorized by natural law?" Have a listen to the author David Wengrow describe his approach in the book on the program Democracy Now!
Well, it goes back to the first question, really. We realized there was something fundamentally strange about the fact that human history is conventionally framed in this way, about a question about the origins of inequality. Where does the question come from? I mean, it already assumes that there's something else, an age of equals or an age of freedom. And tracing it back to its origins, they really go back to an essay competition. In 1753, a French academy poses that question. What is the origin of social inequality? And reflecting on this, we realized this is strange. We're talking about France before the revolution, one of the most hierarchical societies on earth. Why do people already assume that things were once different? And following that line of inquiry led us, as you say, to the Americas and this encounter between European colonists and indigenous societies, particularly around the region of the Great Lakes of what's now Canada. I mean, it was in that area that Europeans first encountered entire societies built on principles of social freedom that were still completely alien to European civilizations at the time.
Now, this contest was entered by Enlightenment thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Though he did not actually win the contest, he transformed his work into The Discourses on Inequality, where he famously posited that private property is the root of human inequality. Quote, "The first man who, having enclosed off a piece of land, got the idea of saying, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society," end quote. Though Rousseau did not believe this was a positive development, he believed it was a major mistake. The connection between property and inequality, in general, has been accepted in intellectual circles in Europe and the United States ever since. The authors of The Dawn of Everything make the case that this notion of an unnatural inequality was heavily influenced by Native Americans. Colonization of the Americas put European intellectuals into contact with Native Americans and their ideas, and these Native Americans held up a mirror to Europe via Native political and social organization. This contact happened in all European colonies. However, The Dawn of Everything covers discussions in particular between Jesuit missionaries and Native American groups in what is now Canada. In particular, the Wendat, or as we sometimes say, the Huron, around the Great Lakes region. Yes, that's where the name Lake Huron comes from. Or the Micmac people of what is now Nova Scotia. Jesuit missionaries were well educated and strove to learn the local language of Native American groups, mainly so they could put the Bible into that particular language and convert them all to Christianity. The Jesuits, as a group, had the rare ability to transfer the perceptions of Native Americans into writing which could be widely read. Of course, things may be lost in translation, and it's worth remembering the Jesuits overall believed that the Native American way of life was sinful and wrong. However, this does not mean that we should totally disregard their works as that of an unreliable narrator. For example, the friar Gabriel Sagard commented on the social framework in the Wendat society as described to him by various Wendat Native Americans. Quote, "They reciprocate hospitality and give such assistance to one another that the necessities of all are provided for, without there being any beggar in their towns and villages, and they consider it a bad thing when they hear it said that in France there were a great many of these needy beggars, and thought this was a lack of charity in us, and blamed us for it severely." End quote. In Wendat society, while there were laws and social distinctions, Jesuit missionaries observed that the makeup of these societies were relatively egalitarian. They were egalitarian in the sense that individuals were free to disobey their chiefs, and that the traditions of reciprocity and generosity meant that one could theoretically leave their group, go to another group, and be received there. This is fascinating because it presents a different conception of what the word freedom actually means. Now, the book itself goes much further into detail on this, so if you'd like to know more, I suggest you go ahead and give the book a read. Numerous accounts of Native American societies, such as Sagard's The Great Journey to the Land of the Hurons, published in 1632, were published throughout Europe and had a great impact. For example, both John Locke and Voltaire have cited Sagard's work in their own writings, a clear connection between European thinkers and the words of Native Americans. In addition to the writings and accounts of the Jesuits, there is evidence that Native Americans themselves engaged with and critiqued European society of the Enlightenment era. The story of the Wendat leader Kandiaronk and the minor French noble Louis Armand Baron de la Hontan are examples of this. Kandiaronk, a leader of the Wendat people, was one of the most influential Native American leaders in the region at the time. Playing the Wendat's enemies, the Iroquois and the French and the English, off one another, he attempted to save his people from utter destruction at the hands of the more numerous Iroquois. Numerous times he rallied his people and defeated the Iroquois in several pitched battles. Now, Le Hontan was a minor French noble, a military man who joined the French military in Canada at the age of 17, and he fought the English along with various native groups over the course of his career. He did, however, take the time to learn the Wendat language, giving him a unique insight for one of the elite of the colony. Traditionally, it was fur trappers and missionaries who took the time to learn native languages. Near the end of his life, and having fallen from grace and lost his inheritance, Le Hontan published several books in an attempt to raise money, one of which was Dialogues avec la Sauvage Adario, or Dialogues with the Savage Adario. My apologies for my French pronunciation. The text purports to be a discussion between himself and Adario, another name for Kandiaronk, over various topics of European society in the Enlightenment era, such as laws, punishments, religion, property, and the use of money. Kandiaronk, within this dialogue, has based his thoughts on the observations of the city of Montreal, New York, and Paris. There are examples of skeptical rationalism. For example, Kandiaronk wonders why the Great Spirit, which is what he calls the Christian God, in order to prevent conflict between believers, would simply not reveal himself to all peoples, in order to prevent the evils of religious war. Religious wars which had torn Europe asunder for 150 years. This criticism of Christian tradition, interestingly, predates many of the major Enlightenment thinkers who would be similarly critical of the church and religious tradition. In describing the use of money, Kandiaronk said, quote, "I affirm that what you call money is the devil of devils. To imagine one could live in the country of money and preserve one's soul is to imagine one could preserve one's life at the bottom of a lake. Tell me that we Wendat are not right in refusing to touch or so much as to look at silver." End quote. The conclusion of this critique is that money transforms part of French society into a useless class of people, notably the rich, who have amassed a great deal of money, and this makes society fundamentally unequal and unjust, which Kandiaronk claims is not so in Wendat society. Now, I find this particular criticism of money very telling. For all the reputation of the Enlightenment as a time of asking deep questions, they certainly did not question, well, most of them did not question, the system of money and property that existed. And even Rousseau was not seriously advocating uprooting the property regime of the time. Only Thomas Paine, an American Enlightenment era thinker, came even close with his calls for property redistribution and a universal income. And this is why I think Native Americans are some of the best grounds for evaluating Enlightenment ideas as radical or maybe not radical. As the Jesuits pointed out, Native Americans had no no experience with the traditions of the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans. And money and coinage has played a major role in all societies that claim some sort of connection to ancient Greeks, so only a group so divorced from this legacy would be able to question features and modes of thought, or at least provide novel critiques of these features and modes of thought. The native critique extends into our own modern world. One example would be how many Native Americans have recently been very critical of contemporary ecological management practices in the United States. In particular, preventing wildfires. Now, traditionally, Native groups in California allowed for small burns of wild areas in the name of production and environmental management, a practice which was suppressed following the acquisition of California by the United States. For a long time, it was debated if the dialogues with the savage Adario actually contained the words of Kandiaronk himself. The most poignant criticism was that many of the claims are simply exaggerated. For example, the Wendat people did have laws, some forms of social distinction, and some forms of wealth accumulation, although it was not money per se as we currently understand it. Scholars argue that this form of dialogue was simply a means to get around church censorship in France by having a savage criticized French society. Additionally, La Hontan has been accused by contemporary readers of creating the concept of the noble savage archetype in literature, the uncritical and stereotypical view of Native Americans. It's true the work was probably a bit embellished in order to make money. After all, La Hontan was broke and desperately in need of funds. However, Kandiaronk was a contemporary of La Hontan. They engaged in at least one battle, and they may have engaged in a real debate at the Salon of the French governor of Quebec in 1690. Most Europeans who met Kandiaronk commented on his insightful nature and debating skills, and Kandiaronk himself may have visited Europe as part of a Wendat delegation sent to Paris in 1694. Regardless, the book became amazingly popular, and it inspired numerous imitators, using an outsider to criticize their society, such as Montesquieu's Persian Letters or Diderot's Voyages from Bougainville. One of the most popular examples of these imitation dialogues is Letters from a Peruvian Woman, published in 1747 by the female writer Françoise de Graffigny. In this story, an Incan princess is abducted and is taken to France, where she proceeds to criticize French social and political structures in a letter to an Incan noble. Quote, "The government of this empire, France, entirely different from yours, cannot fail to be imperfect. Whereas the Incan ruler is obliged to provide for the sustenance of his people, the sovereigns in Europe derive their own solely from the labors of their subjects. As a result, almost all crimes and misfortunes are the results of the needs which have not been adequately satisfied." End quote. Now, this description is not completely fair. After all, the Incans were an empire with a divine ruler, not a hippie commune. It is known, however, that de Graffigny was inspired by Comentarios Reales de los Incas, published 130 years earlier, in which tells the story of the Incan people, the empire, and in particular, that of the Incan state, which provided food for its subjects in times of difficulties, preventing starvation. This relief presented a kind of equality, the equality to not die of hunger. One person who read and responded to de Graffigny's work was Anne-Robert-Jacques Turgot, a French economist. Turgot wrote a letter to de Graffigny, and among his criticisms was the idea that the supposed beneficence of the Incan ruler would interfere with society and create a degree of equality. This was, according to Turgot, not good. He argues that the differences in what he terms natural talent would inevitably create different classes in society. These different classes would produce new scientific and economic modes of production out of their own self-interest, and this change in scientific and economic modes of production is what would move society forward. In short, complex societies inevitably have some inequality, and that's not a bad thing. We truly do live in a society. Turgot conceptualized his ideas into what we now call the theory of progress. This idea is that there is a fixed path for all human societies via technological and economic progress, which leads to social evolution from nomadism to settled agriculture and ending in complex free market societies, which are the best, or the most civilized, as Turgot put it. Can you guess which one France falls into? From his work on universal history. Quote, "Every day we see arts invented. In some parts of the world, we see people who are civilized and enlightened, and in other parts, nomadic peoples, in the depths of the forests. In an eternity of time, this inequality and progress would have been bound to disappear." End quote. This concept that we are all progressing towards a market-oriented, enlightenment-based society went on to influence thinkers such as Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, and David Hume. Even contemporary intellectuals such as Steven Pinker and, I don't know, any social or economic conservative figurehead out there today. This is fine. Everything is just fine. That Turgot and his contemporaries, and those he would go on to influence, fundamentally rejected the Native American idea of equality and shaped their own in contrast to it, would go on to influence world history. From the liberalism after the Age of Revolutions to socialist thought, Friedrich Engels citing Native American social organizations as part of his inspiration. When discussing the Age of Enlightenment, we should keep in mind the native critique. Whether that is a direct criticism, such as the words of Kandiaronk, or as a response to popular understandings of Native American society, such as the Incan Empire and the theory of progress, the native critique is a reminder of the contribution of Native Americans to the history of ideas during this time, a time period in which Native Americans are usually written out of the history books. If you'd like to know more, I would seriously consider reading The Dawn of Everything. I actually wanted to physically have a copy here, but my bookstore apparently had their last copy stolen. I cannot recommend it enough all the same. For more specifics on the native critique outside of the primary sources, such as Le Hontan's Voyages to the New World, I cannot seem to find any books that deal very specifically with this issue, but there are some books that touch on it, such as Contact Points, American Frontiers from the Mohawk Valley to the Mississippi. It goes without saying that this is definitely a field in need of more research. But I sincerely hope you found that interesting and helpful, and if you found that helpful, why not consider subscribing so we can continue to learn things together. But I want to thank you so much for joining me. My name is Mr. Little, and I will see you next time.